Great. Well, welcome to all our listeners to our new session of POP Presenting Our Presence, which is a monthly vodcast co-hosted by Dr. Florence Glanfield and myself, Cindy Gaudet. And so today we have a special guest, Kateryna Barnes, who is our guest co-host. So happy to have you on, Kateryna. You were a previous guest in another episode, so thanks for coming back and joining us. And our POP guest today is Nella Sajlovic. So before we move to Nella to introduce herself, I'll pass it on to Kateryna. You can tell us who you are, where you come from, why you're happy to be our guest today, our co-host guest today.
Hi, thank you, Cindy. Hi, I'm Kateryna. I work in the Faculty of Education doing communications and web development. I descend from Ukrainian settlers and Haudenosaunee folk from out east. So I'm a settler no matter what here in Edmonton. And I'm really stoked that we get to talk with Nella today. Hello, Nella.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nella Sajlovic. I am a member of the Michel First Nation, which is located just north of Edmonton in the St. Albert area. My father's side are Iroquois and Cree primarily, and also French. And my mom's side are settlers that immigrated from Italy in the late 1950s. I'm currently the Indigenous Strategies Manager in the Office of the Vice Provost, Indigenous Programming and Research. And I've been at the university for a while now, coming on 18 years in a number of different spaces. And I'm thrilled to be here with you all today for this conversation.
Super. Well, we are happy to have you with us, Nella. And I kind of go back to how this all started with our virtual teas during COVID and meeting you both, Nella and Kateryna. So kind of, resituating ourselves in this inspiration of this work where we were meeting through virtual teas. And I'm so grateful. I've, through the teas, been meeting all these incredible and Indigenous scholars, and everyone's doing so many amazing things in different parts of the faculty. So as part of POP, it's like presenting our presence, celebrating who we are as Indigenous people and the unique ways of what we bring life to or animate or contribute to the University of Alberta. And so in your role, and I've got to work with you in your new role as well. So glad we can carry on this visit in this way, and soon in person over tea, which will be fantastic. So when we were talking last week about what you wanted to share on POP, you brought up so many important things about how we disrupt these colonial myths, these narratives, and owning ourselves, and especially through your own family story, and how that's important to bring that to the forefront. So if you want to, tell us a little bit more about that and why that's important to you in terms of these. Yeah, the big theme was on this disrupting of these myths that continue. And I guess this is a platform that we can do that amongst one another and have these important conversations and keep learning from each other who we are and learning about all the unique bundles and stories that we carry with us. So grateful for you taking the time to have this one-on-one with us.
It's wonderful to have this opportunity to share, and it's really at the heart of why I took my current role. For example, I recall growing up that I grew up with these amazing stories of my forefathers, particularly my 3 times great-grandfather was a Mohawk man from what is present-day Montreal. And in 1799, he signed on as an agent of the Northwest Trading Company as a voyageur. And I remember my dad telling me about the journey, because it had been passed down in family lore of them traversing all the way from Montreal to Alberta in the company of these settler explorers and traders. And they did so over the course of 8 or 9 months in every type of weather. And even then they were famous for their skill and their bravery. And they left Montreal because they wanted to return to a more traditional way of living. And they found that even then, 223 years ago, there was so much settlement that their ways were being disrupted. So they signed on there, and he was but one of several contingents of Mohawk men that were part of this exploration. And he came out west, and as he did, they participated in the trade routes that established current day Alberta and much of Western Canada. And it was passed down in our family stories that he accompanied David Thompson on his tour of the Columbia River. And when I was little, I was always so fascinated by that, because I was learning those stories in school, but I didn't hear the stories of my family taken up in those stories. It was always settlers that were part of that exploration. And then knowing the other pieces as they settled, they intermarried into Cree families, and these very strong Cree women, these matriarchs that they built families with. And one of those ancestors, my great grandmother, her name was Victoria Callihoo, and she was a very famous medicine woman who was known for her ability to heal people for all kinds of injuries. And it was anything from stopping hemorrhaging after a birth to a wound inflicted in the buffalo hunt, to even knowing herbal medicines well enough to cure advanced infection. And she saved a lot of lives, both settlers and Indigenous. And it was out of this history, this sharing of history, that I came to know my father's side. And it was also a really deep love for my dad. So I wound up being raised by my adoptive dad, who is actually a family. So I'm also a Callihoo. And he was 60 when I was born. And we were really lucky. He lived till he was 102, passing in 2018. And I think in part because of his own long life and his position as a respected elder, I learned all of these amazing stories. And these stories were really fuel for how we took up our roles, our broader roles in community. But they were also deeply at odds with what I saw represented in school and in the narratives that were more familiar of this, at the very best, a benevolent Indian that stepped aside for progress, or at the very worst, this idea of a diminished people that were dependent on the state, and which were completely false. And I knew this to be true. And so it's been a deeply personal journey to know these pieces of our history, and to feel like I have this responsibility to represent particularly my band and my dad, and all of the pieces that Canadians are only now just becoming more familiar with. So the stories about disenfranchisement, about the residential school, about the Indian agent, they were all part of what I grew up knowing. And to have come into a space where it's now possible, through my personal relationships, but also through my work, to share these stories has been a really powerful part of my own personal and professional journey.
Brings something to mind as I listen to you speaking about your father and your grandparents and those generations who made that journey, and how, as when we're here at the University of Alberta and the ways which we contribute, it's like we're never doing it individually or alone. Like every time we speak about our relations. And anyway, that's just kind of really hitting me about, oh wow, yeah, when we come, we carry. Sylvia Miracle I just read a beautiful article. She says, as leaders, we carry the bones of our people in the ways in which we lead. Isn't that powerful? And it's so true. As you're speaking, it's you're carrying them with you, because or carrying each other in some sense. So then when we think about our contributions and our roles wherever we are, we're not doing it as individually. So we're kind of also then interrupting that very neoliberal, individualized way of being or leading.
Yes, that absolutely resonates. And I think part of that is carrying those stories, knowing who your people are, particularly when you see members of your own family or even your larger community misrepresented. So then it becomes both an opportunity and this very, in some ways, painful burden to have to insert yourself into conversations to share what you know, the reality of their lived experiences. And that becomes doubly difficult when you know the other pieces that are part of the trauma that I know my family carries and Indigenous peoples carry. So aside from this history of being able advocates for themselves with Louis' journey from Montreal to present day Alberta, there's then his son who goes on to sign a treaty adhesion in 1878 to Treaty 6 and tries to establish this reserve. But then all of the experiences that follow were deeply harmful to Indigenous people. And I have a collection of these stories out of like the Indian Agents reports and the Canadian Census, in which our band is described as healthy and successful, excellent farmers, excellent ranchers, good healers, all of these things that recognize the collective ability. But then as time passes, there are other experiences with the state that continuously aim to subjugate Indigenous people, starting with the forced relocation. In our band was one of the Indian bands that were duped by Frank Oliver, and now people are becoming more familiar with that piece, where they were coerced into selling parts of their land, which they did so at auction, and then didn't receive payment for 14 years. And then they weren't able to advocate on behalf of themselves because of the provisions of the Indian Act, which didn't allow them to hire a lawyer. So it's very underhanded. And then, of course, this past year, particularly, the residential school experience was something that was also part of my dad's story. And he spent 6 years there. And all of the pieces that we're now, the community is more broadly coming to know were stories that I grew up with about his brother dying in the residential school because the nuns refused the expense of a doctor. He died of a very painful death of appendicitis, of their hunger, of the beatings, of kids that ran away and never came back. And other pieces that I think, now the TRC has done this very powerful work of bringing the residential school story forward. But there are other pieces that I think a lot of people are perhaps unfamiliar with, that you couldn't leave the reserve without a pass. And for my own family story, as they became more and more successful in farming the land and adopting this hybrid life that was more acceptable to settlers, as there was greater and greater settlement around, non-Indigenous settlers lobbied the Indian agent to use his powers to prevent members of the band to sell their stock, to sell their wheat, to participate in other activities because they were competition to the settlers that were around. So you see this artificial whittling away of the power of these really impressive people, but all throughout these really horrific experiences, restrictions of movement, theft of children, abuse, none of these powers, they continuously advocated for a revised relationship with the state. Members of the family were, they were at the the start of John Callihoo, for example, was a key to the start of the League of Indians, and Felix Callihoo was at the start of the Métis Association of Alberta. And all of this is couched in this experience of being very strong, autonomous Indigenous peoples, but then still trying to find a way to navigate this, continuously re-navigate this new reality with the settler communities that are around them, and the laws that influence their lives.
One huge element that you speak of that I think is not heard of enough or understood enough in terms of the nuances that you talk about is also the nuanced ways of erasure, right? It's like these nuanced ways, and I had never considered that the stereotype or the labeling of the benevolent Indian, in some sense, that is so generous, share, but like then just removes itself. So it's like another form of erasure. Anyway, I'm just so appreciative of the pieces that you're helping us like pick up some of those pieces and think critically, right? I'm going to pass it to Kateryna here, because there was one huge piece in our discussion that you had brought up around defiance, and Kateryna had some lovely insights around that.
Thank you. There was, like, you had talked a bit about kind of like the strands of defiance that you've seen in your family, and you've talked about like the stories and humor and the power in that. One of the things I think about when listening to you tell your stories, Nella, are when Thomas King writes, "The truth about stories is that's all we are." And I hear your stories and I hear a lot of strength. I hear resilience. I hear joy. I hear like wisdom. It's a really beautiful thing. And I guess I would love to hear more about how you walk in your day-to-day life and your work at the university with those stories.
Yeah, it's definitely deeply at the heart of what I do. So my current role as Indigenous Strategies Manager is to support Dr. Florence Glanfield, who is our Vice Provost, Indigenous Programming and Research, in the development of a number of different initiatives in support of Indigenous faculty, students, and staff, and their participation in the university. One of which is an Indigenous institutional strategic plan. And I think there's an incredible power in knowing these stories and in feeling that there's room to represent my family and to know what these lived experiences mean, to not be legally allowed to pursue a post-secondary education, to lose Indian status if you marry a non-Indigenous person, to not be able to vote, to not be able to leave the reserve. And I have this feeling, particularly as the residential schools have surfaced this year, that there is this collective reckoning where people are coming to terms with a part of history that was very deliberately silenced, but also a sort of a sentiment that this is a history long past, that this is hundreds of years ago, that there was ancestral participation, but that it isn't really quite with us in the present day. And I know for myself, being part of the university, which I've loved the experience of working here, it's really an amazing thing to be able to share those stories and to be able to correct as part of the work that we're doing in VPIPR, and particularly in being able to say, I'm 44 years old. My own dad was taken at 2.5 to a residential school and spent nearly 10 years there along with his siblings. They said that they didn't take children until they were 5, but my granny passed away, and all of the children, if you can imagine, were taken from my grandpa in one go. So he loses his wife, and then he loses all of his children. And having attended one himself, he understood that they would be abused. He understood that they would be wouldn't be fed, that they couldn't talk to their siblings. So that's but one example, but then all of the other pieces with the band, for example, in 1928, the Indian agent came to members of the band and said they had been advocating and having quite a lot of success trying to get a school built, because they didn't want to send their children to a residential school anymore. And so as a leaver, understanding the harms of that, the Indian agent said, if you enfranchise, that is, give up your Indigenous rights, this school is a possibility. So that was one piece. And then later, there was extreme pressure and misinformation that informed the second attempt, successful attempt on the part of the government to enfranchise my entire band, which took place in 1958 with only small participation. So they were able to coerce a small group, and to the best of my knowledge, it's the only time in Canadian history that an entire band lost their Indian status, and that had incredible ramifications for my family, for the entire band. And so in the work that we do at the university in this current age that's more receptive to truth and reconciliation, a key piece of this is being able to link back to the participation of the state in coercion, in harm. Almost every sort of key piece of the narrative, the Indigenous narrative, is something that my family and almost every Indigenous person has experienced, one of which is the Indian hospitals. So that's another piece that's coming to light now. My Auntie Doreen spent 7 years there being experimented on as she tried to recover from TB. And so it's, I think there, as you said, Cindy, there's an incredible resilience in our people, and there's a willingness to name things for what they were, to see the harm that was done, but also to acknowledge that we're still here, still working towards health, towards protecting each other, to find spaces in which we might make sure that our kids are educated, that they find success that honors their own identity, but also their identity in the larger world. So I really do feel that there is an incredible power and a deep responsibility to be in the space that I'm in, and to be able to have even one-off conversations with colleagues or other people that are in positions of power, to share these stories, to ground them, because I think we grew up with the more common term is whitewashed, but I really resonate with a term that's called maple washing. And this is this Canadian penchant for a very sanitized version of history that silences Indigenous narratives, that makes it seem like we were an inactive part of our history, when that's simply not true. But that's done for a particular mythology. It's to preserve this idea of the Canadian state that emerged out of a free and open, uninhabited land that was just theirs for the taking, when that's simply not true. And it required the silencing, the subjugation, and quite frankly, the violence that Indigenous peoples experienced for the current Canada to be born as we know it now. And we're only just tackling and only just coming to terms with those truths.
That's super powerful and like very heavy, but very honest stuff. And when you have these stories and like they are powerful, they're weighty, like that also speaks to the strength of you carrying them, and you bring that to your work. It's a kind of a very beautiful resilience and defiance.
Thank you. I hope that I do it justice. I know this last year has been really painful. I'm not certain that people fully understand what it's like to know these stories, and to imagine your 2.5-year-old dad taken from his parents, or him and his brother ran away so many times that they were eventually separated. So having lost their mom, lost their dad, to prevent them from running away, they put them at different residential schools. And then all of the other pieces it is very weighty, but I also think that it's a testament to the strength, whether it's in 2022 or in 1799 when old Louis signed that contract. These are people that own their own strength, that are navigating their own lives, that are navigating their own collective history. But it is really weighty, and I know, especially for my adoptive dad, he was such a remarkable human being. He was so well respected in our band, and he had this remarkable memory. He lived to 102, and there were times where he would share these stories where, I mean, he could tell you how many bushels they pulled off of a crop in the 40s, or how much snow fell, and this remarkable memory, but this remarkable and accurate memory of the things that happened are a very powerful counter to the counter narratives that I see emerging this year as people try and make sense of what they grew up, what they thought they knew growing up, as opposed to the real truths. And so I think of him often. Yesterday was his birthday, would have been his 106th birthday. And I feel his presence with me, but also all of the people that are against all odds finding their ways into the spaces that we're more familiar with at the university. And one of the most powerful things has been meeting cousins at the university. I have met so many Michel band members, and that aha, when you go, oh, who are you from? Who are your people? I know it's so incredibly moving to know all that backstory. We don't walk around with a banner that says what preceded us, but this is very much at the heart of who we are as Indigenous people. And I recall attending, very early on when I took this role, I attended a celebration with the Métis Nation of Alberta, and it featured speeches from students that had made their way through the institution, and they've been supported through funding through the M&A. And on the back of it was this list of students, and it was all of the names that I was familiar with: Latond, La Rondelle, Desjardins, Callihoo, and Baptiste. And it really struck me in that moment as I held this paper. These are these families that, for every effort to hold them back, had still found a way. And I remember thinking of my dad in that moment, and I would have loved to have been able to say to him, this is old Jean-Pierre's great-great-granddaughter, or this is Victoria's grandson. There's an incredible power in that we're still here, and that we're making our way through these things. And I'm honored to be a part of this work.
Such a good piece in terms of making those connections, right? When we see those names or meet a cousin, for me, it's like there's a coming home in that moment, right? That just is beyond time and space almost. It's that connectivity, right? It's like this joy of community. And you're making me think also about the remembrance of those who, like you said, made their way so that we could still have those connectivities. In a lot of the work, I think about the role of the women, right, of the maintain of our kinship, but the extended part of all those what we speak often so much about relationality and what that looks like. And somehow, we have these terms, but there's something you're making me think about more deeply in this conversation, is this embodied leadership. It's like, it's not a check mark. When I hear you speaking about why you're doing what you're doing at the U of A, you're reminding me, it's like, oh yeah, we're not doing an institutional plan, like check, we did the plan. No, it's deeper than that. It's really the embodied piece, because there's this knowing of those stories, even if they're not all the stories, right? As we're picking up pieces together collectively, and then the power of the collection, the power of the collective coming together. And
Absolutely.
I'm beginning to understand why that might have been so threatening, of coming together would have become illegal, because there's such power in it, right? So
Absolutely.
This embodied leadership. Yeah. Well, thank you. Oh my goodness, ever so much, Nella, for this sharing and these teachings, like maple washing. Could you write about that, please? Let's have a new term. And I'll pass it to Kateryna if you have some closing thoughts for Nella and for our listeners.
No, thank you. I always feel like I just want to hear more about like Nella's relations, especially Victoria Callihoo. Like, for those in the know, Callihoo is a strong name with a lot of strong people. And so like when you tell me about this amazing medicine woman or your dad, it's so beautiful. And I'm so grateful to be a part of this conversation and hear about these people who made you who you are, and you're awesome. So I thank you.
Really appreciate that, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share their story, and also really grateful that we've come into a time where there are these efforts to bridge these silenced narratives. And I mean, one of the wards in Edmonton, as part of the ward renaming in the city of Edmonton, was named Callihoo, which of course is the original name before it got changed by priests and the like. But I think it's these spaces where we look at the work that we do, that we've been asked to do as an institution, that we can really affect change. So not only carrying forward the stories and helping people understand what they didn't know as part of that silence narrative, but also practically tackling the impediments that were put in place. So the way a lot of Indigenous individuals and communities struggle is an artificial state. It is an artificial state that was manufactured by the restrictions that the state put in place, where we couldn't gather, couldn't practice ceremony, couldn't wear traditional garb, couldn't vote, couldn't, all of the things that are enumerated that were very much part of the Indian Act and other measures. So when we're talking about the strategic plan, what does it mean to tackle the financial barriers that a student might face because of this artificial state? What does it mean to acknowledge that there are different understandings of family and different responsibilities, and bringing the institution to a space where it bridges its colonial identity with its responsibility as an educational institution to ensure that all people in Alberta and beyond are educated. So I think there's a great power in the stories, but there's also a great power in starting in the spaces that practically tackle this artificial state. And I think that there are prophecies that talk about there needing to be 7 generations before Indigenous peoples find healing and they're able to come into their own again. And I feel like the TRC was this shift in consciousness for Canadians, where it's really been a turning point, where these stories are coming to light, and the agency, the autonomy, the beauty, and the strength of Indigenous peoples are only just being recognized.
Thanks for bringing that teaching of 7 generations. It reminds me of when Dr. Trudy Cardinal, who did the beadwork and really wanted to feature her granddaughter so that she would know we're here, Indigenous people are here, and she will be welcome at the University of Alberta. So that's part of also the work that we're always doing. And thank you for reminding us of that. Yes, it's our story, but it's the systemic and the structural changes that will take time. And we're the continuity, right? We're the continuity of the Grandpa Louis that we're so many of us are connected to, who made that big journey. So hi and merci for taking us on this beautiful journey together today, and to Kateryna and to Kyle and to all our listeners. Merci.
I swear, everyone affiliated with Michel Band, it's like instead of having like just that one family member who like tracks the family tree on ancestry.com, it's everyone in Michel Band does that verbally. Like, it's amazing.